A millionaire mocked the little pianist. His performance left the entire ballroom speechless. The lights inside the grand ballroom were so bright that Eli Turner had to blink twice before his eyes adjusted. His hands were cold, even though the room was warm. He pressed them together and looked down at the black case in his lap. Inside it were sheet papers, worn at the edges, filled with notes his mother had written by hand because they could not afford printed music books. He was 10 years old, sitting alone on a small wooden bench behind a velvet curtain, waiting for his name to be called. On the other side of that curtain, more than 300 people were laughing, talking, and clinking glasses filled with expensive drinks. Eli had never seen so much wealth in one room. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls of light. Waiters in white gloves moved silently between tables covered in silk cloths. He did not belong here. He knew it. And in a few minutes everyone else would know it too. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. He thought about his mother, Grace, who was standing somewhere near the back of the hall, watching through the crowd because she had not been given a seat at any table. She had worn her only good dress tonight, faded blue with a small tear near the hem that she had sewn shut with careful stitches. She always told him the same thing before every performance. "Let the music answer for you." Eli closed his eyes and tried to remember those words now, but his mind kept slipping back to how they had arrived at this place. 3 weeks earlier, a letter had come to their small apartment, printed on thick cream paper with gold lettering at the top. It invited Eli Turner to perform at the Kane Foundation Charity Gala, an event hosted by one of the wealthiest men in the city, Richard Kane. At first, Grace thought it was a mistake. People like them did not receive invitations like this, but the letter explained everything. The event coordinator, a kind man named Daniel Cole, had grown up in their old neighborhood. Years ago, when Daniel was a boy with no money for lessons, Grace had taught him piano for free, sitting beside him every Saturday afternoon on a cracked wooden bench in the community center. He never forgot her kindness. Now that he organized events for wealthy patrons across the city, he wanted to give something back. He remembered that Grace had a son, and he had heard whispers about a boy who played piano like nothing anyone had heard before. He wanted Eli to have a chance most children like him would never get. Grace had cried when she read the letter, not because of the invitation itself, but because it meant her years of sacrifice had somehow found their way back to her, wrapped in an unexpected gift for her son. Eli had practiced every night after that. Their apartment was small, with thin walls and a kitchen that doubled as a hallway. Their piano was not really a piano at all, but an old electronic keyboard with 2 broken keys that Grace had found at a secondhand shop for almost nothing. Eli had learned to play around the broken notes, adjusting his fingers so quickly that most people never noticed anything was missing. He was not just going to play a simple piece tonight. He had written his own composition, something he had never shown to anyone outside his mother. It was a song about work and worry and love, though it had no words. It was the sound of Grace waking up before sunrise to clean houses across the city. It was the sound of her walking home late at night, tired but still humming a tune to keep her spirits up. It was the sound of every sacrifice she had made so that Eli could have music in his life, even when they had almost nothing else. He had never played it for a crowd before. Tonight would be the very first time. A soft knock came against the wall beside the curtain, and Daniel Cole appeared, smiling warmly. He knelt down so that he was at eye level with Eli. "You look nervous," Daniel said gently. "I am," Eli admitted. Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. "That is normal. Every great musician feels this way before they play. It means you care. Just remember why you are here." Eli nodded slowly, though his stomach still felt tight as a fist. Before Daniel could say anything else, a voice rang out from the hallway behind them, sharp and impatient. "Where is my assistant? I asked for the schedule 10 minutes ago." Daniel stood quickly, his expression shifting into something more careful, more guarded. "That is Mr. Kane," he whispered to Eli. "He can be difficult sometimes. Just stay calm and focus on your music." Eli had heard the name Richard Kane before. Everyone in the city had. He owned buildings that touched the sky, hotels that cost more per night than most families earned in a month, and a reputation that made people speak his name with either admiration or quiet fear. He was known as a brilliant businessman, but also as a man who rarely showed patience for anyone he considered unimportant. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing louder and sharper against the marble floor. Eli felt his chest tighten again, though he did not yet understand why. He simply had a feeling, the kind that settles low in the stomach before something difficult happens. The footsteps stopped just outside the curtain. A tall man stepped into view, dressed in a black suit so perfectly tailored that it seemed to have been shaped around him by hand. His hair was combed back without a single strand out of place, and his eyes moved quickly across the small space, taking in every detail. When his gaze landed on Eli, something in his expression shifted. Confusion first, then something colder. "Who is this?" Richard Kane asked, his voice flat and unimpressed. Daniel stepped forward quickly. "Mr. Kane, this is Eli Turner. He is one of tonight's performers. He was invited as part of the outreach program you approved last month, remember? The program that brings young talented musicians from underserved communities into the spotlight." Richard Kane's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied Eli from head to toe, taking in the boy's second-hand suit, a size too large at the shoulders, and his scuffed shoes that had clearly been polished by hand the night before in an attempt to look presentable. "This is a charity gala for serious donors and serious talent," Richard said slowly, as if explaining something obvious to a child. "Not a place to make people feel good about themselves." Eli felt his face grow warm. He looked down at his shoes, unsure of what to say. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Richard turned and walked away, his shoes clicking sharply against the floor, his voice already moving on to some other complaint about the evening's arrangements. Daniel exhaled slowly and turned back to Eli, forcing a small, reassuring smile onto his face. "Don't listen to him," he said. "He has a lot on his mind tonight. This is not about him. This is about you and your music." But Eli had already heard enough. The words echoed inside his head, repeating themselves over and over. Not a place to make people feel good about themselves. He thought of his mother standing somewhere in that enormous room, wearing her only good dress, believing tonight might finally be a moment where her son's talent was seen and celebrated, rather than dismissed. He thought about all the nights she had come home exhausted, her hands raw from scrubbing floors that were not her own, yet she always found the energy to sit beside him at that old broken keyboard and listen to him play, telling him that one day the whole world would hear what she already knew. Somewhere beyond the curtain, the orchestra began playing a soft, welcoming tune as more guests arrived. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Glasses clinked together in toasts to charity and generosity, though Eli wondered how much of that generosity was real, and how much of it was simply for show. He picked up his sheet music again, holding it carefully in his lap, and closed his eyes. He pictured his mother's face, patient and proud, the way she looked whenever he practiced late into the night despite his tired fingers. He remembered the sound of her voice guiding him through difficult passages, teaching him that music was not about perfection, but about truth. "Let the music answer for you." He repeated the words silently to himself, like a promise. Whatever happened next, whatever Richard Kane thought of him, Eli knew one thing for certain. When his fingers finally touched those piano keys, none of it would matter anymore. Only the music would remain. Daniel returned a few minutes later, glancing at his watch. 15 minutes, he said softly. "Are you ready?" Eli looked up, his eyes steady now despite the nervous fire still burning quietly in his chest. "Yes," he said. But somewhere deep inside, he sensed that the real challenge of the night was still waiting for him, hidden just beyond that heavy velvet curtain, where Richard Kane and hundreds of wealthy strangers sat completely unaware of what was about to unfold before them. 10 minutes passed, and Eli sat perfectly still, listening to the muffled sounds beyond the curtain. Voices rose and fell. Somewhere a string quartet played a light, cheerful piece, the kind of music meant to fill silence rather than fill hearts. He tried to steady his breathing, in through his nose, out through his mouth, the way his mother had taught him whenever nerves threatened to take over. Then the curtain beside him rustled again, and this time it was not Daniel who appeared. Richard Kane stepped through with a glass of dark red wine in one hand, his jacket now unbuttoned, his tie loosened just slightly, as though the evening's small victories had made him more comfortable, more willing to speak his mind without restraint. Behind him followed two other guests, a woman in a shimmering silver gown, and a man with silver hair and a booming laugh that seemed to fill any space he entered. Richard's eyes landed on Eli again, and this time a thin smile crossed his lips, though it held no warmth at all. "So this is our little charity project," he said, turning slightly toward his companions as though presenting an exhibit. "Daniel tells me the boy is supposed to be some kind of prodigy." The woman in silver studied Eli with mild curiosity, tilting her head. "He does look very young," she offered carefully. "Young and untrained, most likely," Richard said, taking a slow sip of his wine. "These outreach programs are well-intentioned, I suppose, but let us be honest with ourselves. Talent like that does not simply appear out of nowhere. It takes years of proper instruction, expensive instructors, private tutors, not broken keyboards in some run-down apartment." Eli's stomach twisted painfully. He had never told Richard Kane about his keyboard, about the broken keys, about the years of practicing without proper lessons. Somehow the assumption cut deeper than if it had been true information shared with cruelty. It meant Richard had built an entire picture of Eli's life in his mind, based on nothing more than the boy's clothes and the neighborhood listed on some outreach form. The silver-haired man let out a short laugh. "Come now, Richard, give the boy a chance. Perhaps he will surprise you." Richard shook his head slowly, clearly enjoying the attention of his small audience. "I doubt it. I have sat through enough of these charity performances to know exactly how they go. A nervous child stumbles through some simple piece everyone claps for out of politeness, and then we all go back to pretending we made a difference in someone's life." He turned back toward Eli, his expression growing sharper. "Tell me, boy, have you ever performed for a real audience before? Or is tonight simply your very first time holding a piano to more than a few relatives in a living room?" Eli's throat felt dry. He wanted to answer, to defend himself, to explain that he had performed at school events, at the community center, even once at a local competition where he had placed among the top students despite being years younger than everyone else. But the words caught somewhere behind his fear, and all he managed to say was a quiet, almost inaudible response. "I have performed before, sir." Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Is that so?" Before Eli could respond further, Daniel returned, his face tightening with concern the moment he saw Richard standing there. "Mr. Kane," he said carefully, "we should probably let Eli prepare. He goes on shortly." Richard waved a dismissive hand. "I am simply getting to know tonight's performers, Daniel. Surely that is not against the rules." Daniel's jaw tensed, but he said nothing further, aware that challenging one of the evening's largest donors in front of other guests would only make things more difficult. Richard took another slow sip of his wine, his eyes never leaving Eli. "Let me offer you some advice, boy," he said, his voice lowering slightly, taking on a tone that almost sounded like concern, though Eli sensed something far colder hiding underneath it. "Do not embarrass yourself out there tonight. This room is filled with people who have heard some of the finest musicians in the world perform in concert halls twice the size of this ballroom. They did not come here to watch a charity case fumble through a piece he barely knows. Perhaps it would be wiser to simply thank Daniel for the kind gesture and step aside gracefully, before things become uncomfortable for everyone involved." The silver-gowned woman shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Richard and the boy, clearly sensing that his words had crossed some invisible line. "Richard, perhaps that is a bit much," she said softly. Richard shrugged, completely unbothered. "I am simply being realistic. Someone has to be." Eli sat frozen, his hands gripping the edges of his sheet music so tightly that the paper began to wrinkle beneath his fingers. He thought about standing up and walking away, disappearing through the back exit before anyone could see him fail. Perhaps Richard was right. Perhaps this entire evening had been a mistake from the very beginning, an invitation extended out of pity rather than genuine belief in his talent. But then he thought of his mother. He thought of her sitting somewhere in that crowded room right now, wearing her one good dress, waiting eagerly for the moment her son would finally step into the light, after years of practicing in the shadows of their small apartment. He thought of every early morning she had woken before dawn, every late night she had come home with aching hands, every meal she had skipped so that there would be enough money for his sheet music and lesson books from the library. If he walked away now, he would not just be walking away from Richard Kane's cruelty. He would be walking away from her sacrifice as well. Something inside him steadied, quiet but firm, like a single note held perfectly in tune beneath a storm of noise. "I am not stepping aside, sir," Eli said, his voice steadier than he expected. Richard blinked, clearly caught off guard by the boy's sudden composure. For a brief moment, something flickered across his face, perhaps surprise, perhaps mild irritation at being challenged by a child. Then his expression hardened once more into practiced indifference. "Very well," he said coolly. "Do not say I did not warn you." He turned and walked away without another word, his two companions following closely behind, the woman in silver glancing back once with an expression that seemed almost apologetic, though she said nothing to stop him. Daniel knelt beside Eli immediately, his face full of concern. "Are you all right? I am so sorry about that. He should not have spoken to you that way." Eli nodded slowly, though his hands were trembling now, adrenaline and hurt mixing together inside his small chest. "I am okay," he said quietly, though his voice wavered slightly on the final word. Daniel studied him carefully. "You do not have to go out there if you do not want to. Nobody would blame you." Eli shook his head firmly. "No, I want to play." Daniel smiled gently, though worry still lingered behind his eyes. "All right then. Just remember what your mother always says. Let the music answer for you." Eli managed a small, determined smile. "That is exactly what I am going to do." Daniel checked his watch again. 5 minutes, he said softly. before standing and disappearing back through the curtain to check on the rest of the evening's arrangements. Alone again, Eli closed his eyes and pressed his palms against his knees to stop them from shaking. He thought about Richard Kane's words, sharp and dismissive, clearly meant to break his confidence before he ever touched a single key. He thought about how easily wealth and status seemed to convince some people that kindness was optional, that cruelty could be excused simply because it came wrapped in expensive clothing and confident words. He thought about his broken keyboard at home, the two silent keys he had learned to play around so skillfully that most people never noticed the gaps. He thought about every hour spent practicing after school while other children played outside, every library book on music theory he had read cover to cover, simply because private lessons were far beyond what his family could ever afford. None of that mattered to Richard Kane. To him, Eli was simply a charity case, a mistake in an otherwise perfect evening of wealth and privilege. But Eli remembered something his mother had told him many times, especially on nights when their apartment felt too small and their circumstances felt too heavy. She always said that people who mock others rarely do so because they see something weak. More often, they do it because somewhere deep inside, they sense something they cannot control, something powerful they do not understand. Eli did not fully understand those words when he was younger, but tonight, sitting behind that heavy velvet curtain with his heart still racing from Richard Kane's cold dismissal, he finally began to understand what she meant. 2 minutes, Daniel's voice called softly from somewhere near the stage entrance. Eli stood slowly, smoothing down his second-hand jacket, and picked up his worn sheet music one final time. He took one last deep breath, steadying himself completely, letting go of Richard Kane's harsh words, letting go of his own fear, letting go of everything except the music waiting quietly inside him, ready to be released. Whatever happened next, whatever the crowd thought when they first saw him step onto that enormous stage, he knew one thing with complete certainty. He was ready. The curtain lifted, and for a moment the light was so bright that Eli could see nothing at all, only a wall of white glare pressing against his eyes. Then, slowly, the room came into focus. Round tables stretched out before him in every direction, covered in white cloth and flickering candles. Faces turned toward the stage, some curious, some indifferent, many still caught in the middle of quiet conversations that had not yet noticed him arrive. Near the back of the room, standing rather than seated, Eli spotted his mother. Grace stood perfectly still, her hands pressed together in front of her chest, her eyes fixed on her son with a mixture of pride and worry that only a mother could carry at the same time. Near the front, close to the stage, Richard Kane sat at a large round table surrounded by other wealthy guests, his wine glass now empty, his expression unreadable, arms folded loosely across his chest. He watched Eli approach the piano bench with the detached interest of someone waiting to be proven right rather than surprised. Eli walked slowly across the polished stage floor, his footsteps echoing softly despite the noise of the crowd. The grand piano waited for him, black and gleaming under the chandelier lights, its lid propped open like a mouth ready to speak. He had never played an instrument so beautiful in his entire life. His fingers itched slightly at the thought, nervous energy mixing with something that felt almost like excitement. He climbed onto the bench and adjusted himself carefully, the way his mother had taught him, shoulders relaxed, spine straight but not stiff, feet positioned gently near the pedals. He placed his worn sheet music on the stand in front of him, though he suspected he would not need to look at it even once. He had played this piece so many times in his mind that the notes existed somewhere deeper than memory now, somewhere closer to instinct. The room had not fully quieted yet. Conversations continued in scattered pockets throughout the ballroom, some guests glancing toward the stage with mild curiosity, others still absorbed in their own private discussions, unaware or uninterested in the small boy now seated at the enormous piano before them. Somewhere near the front, Eli heard a soft, dismissive laugh, quiet but unmistakable. He did not need to look to know where it had come from. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, exhaling slowly. "Let the music answer for you." His fingers touched the keys. The first notes rang out softly into the ballroom, delicate and slow, like the beginning of a memory rather than the start of a performance. A few nearby conversations paused as heads turned toward the stage, surprised by the unexpected tenderness in the sound. The melody unfolded gently, almost hesitant at first, mirroring the quiet uncertainty of early mornings in a small apartment, where a mother rises before the sun to begin another long day of work. The notes rose slightly, still soft but gaining a quiet strength, painting the sound of footsteps down empty stairwells, the creak of a door closing carefully so as not to wake a sleeping child, the hush of a city street before dawn. Eli's fingers moved with a delicacy that seemed impossible for hands so small, each note placed with intention, each pause allowed to breathe before the next phrase began. More heads turned, more conversations quieted. Even the waiters near the back of the room seemed to slow their movements, trays balanced carefully as they paused to listen. The melody shifted, deepening now, the left hand introducing a steady rhythm beneath the right hand's soaring line, like the sound of hands scrubbing floors that were never truly clean, like the endless repetition of labor performed without complaint. There was no anger in the music, only a quiet dignity, a steady resilience that refused to break no matter how heavy the burden became. Richard Kane's arms slowly uncrossed. He leaned forward slightly in his seat, his earlier smugness fading into something far more uncertain. He had expected clumsy fingers, uneven timing, the nervous mistakes of an untrained child. Instead, he was hearing something that felt startlingly complete, technically precise, yet emotionally alive, in a way that even seasoned performers sometimes failed to achieve. The piece built further, the melody growing more complex, weaving two separate musical ideas together, one representing struggle, the other representing hope, chasing each other across the keys like two voices in conversation. Eli's hands moved faster now, gliding effortlessly across octaves, his small fingers stretching to reach chords that seemed almost too wide for a boy his size, yet he never faltered, never hesitated, each note landing exactly where it belonged. By now the entire ballroom had fallen silent. Every conversation had stopped. Every glass had been set down. Every eye in the room had turned toward the small figure seated at the enormous piano, watching in stunned disbelief, as raw, untrained emotion transformed into something that felt almost impossibly polished, almost impossibly mature for someone so young. Grace stood near the back wall, tears sliding silently down her cheeks, though her expression remained steady, filled with quiet pride rather than sorrow. She recognized every phrase, every rise and fall of the melody, because she had lived every moment the music represented. She had never told Eli in words just how difficult those years had been. Yet somehow, through nothing but sound, he had understood everything anyway. The music shifted again, this time slowing, softening, the two competing melodies gradually merging into a single unified theme. It was the sound of resolution, of struggle transforming into strength rather than despair, of sacrifice finding meaning rather than regret. Eli's fingers lightened, playing with a tenderness that seemed to fill every corner of the enormous room, reaching even the guests seated furthest from the stage. Richard Kane sat completely still now, his earlier arrogance replaced by something he had not expected to feel tonight. He found himself thinking, unwillingly, of his own beginnings decades earlier, long before wealth and status had shaped him into the man he had become. He had once been poor as well, though he rarely allowed himself to remember it, having spent years building an identity that erased every trace of that difficult past. Something about the music, about the quiet dignity woven into every note, stirred memories he had long buried beneath layers of success and self-assurance. The piece began building once more, the tempo increasing gradually, the melody climbing higher and higher, gathering strength and momentum like a storm finally breaking free after years of restraint. Eli's entire body moved now, shoulders shifting, head tilting slightly with each phrase, completely lost within the music, no longer aware of the crowd watching him, no longer aware of Richard Kane's earlier cruelty, no longer aware of anything except the sound pouring out from beneath his fingers. The final section arrived, a powerful, sweeping crescendo built from every theme introduced earlier in the piece, now layered together into a single overwhelming wave of sound. Struggle and hope, sacrifice and strength. Every early morning, every long night, every quiet act of love performed without recognition, all of it converged into one final surge of music that filled every corner of the enormous ballroom. Some guests found themselves gripping the edges of their tables, unconsciously leaning forward, as though physically drawn toward the stage. Others sat frozen, eyes wide, completely captivated by what they were witnessing. A few dabbed quietly at their eyes with cloth napkins, unwilling to admit how deeply the performance had moved them. Eli's hands moved faster still, the melody reaching its highest point, each note ringing out clear and powerful across the silent room, before finally, gradually, beginning to slow, to soften, returning at last to the same gentle theme that had opened the piece so many minutes earlier. The storm settled. The struggle found its peace. The final notes rang out softly, tenderly, fading gradually into silence. Eli's fingers lifted from the keys. For a long moment, absolute silence filled the ballroom. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It was as though the entire room needed a moment simply to remember how to breathe after everything they had just witnessed. Then, somewhere near the back, a single chair scraped against the floor as Grace rose to her feet, unable to contain herself any longer, clapping with everything she had, tears streaming freely down her face now, pride radiating from every part of her. Her applause broke the silence like a single spark catching flame. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted. Guests rose from their seats one after another, applause thundering through the enormous room, some guests calling out words of amazement, others simply clapping as hard as they could, completely overwhelmed by what they had just experienced. Eli sat frozen on the piano bench for a moment, blinking in surprise at the wall of sound now surrounding him. He had expected polite applause, perhaps, the kind offered out of courtesy rather than genuine appreciation. He had not expected this, an entire ballroom on its feet, faces filled with astonishment and admiration, some guests even calling out for another piece before he had fully processed what was happening. Near the front of the room, Richard Kane remained seated for several long seconds after everyone else had risen, his expression unreadable, his mind clearly working through something far more complicated than simple applause. Finally, slowly, he rose to his feet as well, though his hands remained still at his sides for a moment longer than everyone else's, as though something inside him needed extra time to catch up with what his ears had already understood. Daniel Cole appeared near the edge of the stage, tears glistening in his own eyes, clapping enthusiastically as he watched the moment unfold. He had known Eli was talented. He had heard whispers about the boy's gift from Grace over the years, but even he had not fully anticipated the sheer power of what they had just witnessed. Eli rose slowly from the piano bench, his legs slightly unsteady, his heart still pounding from the performance. He looked out across the ballroom, at the sea of clapping hands, at faces he had never met before now looking at him with genuine amazement rather than dismissal. And then his eyes found his mother's face near the back of the room, tears streaming freely, hands pressed together now in front of her heart rather than clapping, simply watching her son with an expression of pure, overwhelming pride. In that moment, standing alone on that enormous stage, surrounded by applause from hundreds of strangers, Eli felt something he had never fully felt before, not simply relief, not simply pride, something deeper, something that told him, without any doubt remaining, that his mother's years of sacrifice had never been wasted, not for a single moment. The applause continued, rising and falling in waves, refusing to fade even as long moments passed. Somewhere near the front, Richard Kane remained standing amid the crowd, his earlier certainty completely shattered, staring at the small boy on stage with an expression that had shifted from doubt into something far closer to disbelief. Whatever Richard Kane had expected from tonight, whatever cruel assumptions he had made backstage only minutes earlier, none of it had prepared him for what he had just witnessed, and judging by the stunned expression still frozen across his face, he understood, perhaps for the very first time in a long while, that he had been completely and utterly wrong. The applause finally began to settle after several long minutes, though the energy in the ballroom remained charged, guests turning to one another with wide eyes, exchanging quiet words of astonishment about what they had just witnessed. Eli stood near the piano, unsure exactly what to do next, his hands still trembling slightly from the intensity of the performance. Daniel Cole climbed the small steps onto the stage, a wireless microphone now in his hand, his face still glowing with emotion. He approached Eli gently, placing a warm hand on his shoulder before turning to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel began, his voice carrying easily through the enormous room, "please allow me a moment before we continue with tonight's program." The remaining conversations died away completely, every eye once again fixed on the stage. "What you just witnessed was not simply a talented young performer playing a beautiful piece of music," Daniel continued. "What you witnessed was the result of years of sacrifice, determination, and love, carried out quietly, without recognition, by people who never expected anything in return." He glanced toward Eli, offering him a small, reassuring smile before continuing. "Eli Turner is 10 years old. His mother, Grace Turner, taught piano for years in our community center, often for free, to children whose families could never afford private lessons. I know this firsthand because I was one of those children." A soft murmur rippled through the crowd, surprised expressions appearing on several faces as guests processed this unexpected connection. Daniel's voice grew steadier, more confident, as he continued sharing the story. When Grace could no longer continue teaching due to the demands of supporting her own family, Eli did not stop learning. He taught himself using library books on music theory, practicing for hours every single day on a second-hand electronic keyboard, one that, I am told, has 2 broken keys that no longer produce sound at all. Several guests gasped softly, glancing toward one another in disbelief. The idea that such a masterful, emotionally rich performance had come from a child practicing on a broken instrument, entirely self-taught, seemed almost impossible to accept, yet nobody in that room could deny what their own ears had just experienced. The piece he performed tonight was written entirely by Eli himself, Daniel added, his voice softening. It is a piece dedicated to his mother, representing the sacrifices she made throughout his childhood so that music could remain part of his life, even during the most difficult times. Across the room, heads turned instinctively toward Grace, who stood near the back wall, her cheeks still damp with tears, clearly overwhelmed by the sudden attention now directed her way. Several guests began applauding again, this time directed toward her, acknowledging the quiet, unseen sacrifices that had made tonight's extraordinary performance possible. Near the front of the room, Richard Kane remained standing among the crowd, his expression unreadable, though something in his posture had shifted, his earlier confidence replaced by visible discomfort. Several guests near his table had witnessed his cruel remarks backstage earlier that evening, whispered secondhand through the crowd during the performance's aftermath, and now curious, judgmental glances began drifting in his direction. The silver-gowned woman who had accompanied him earlier leaned toward him slightly, her voice low but clearly audible to those standing nearby. "Richard," she said carefully, "did you actually say those things to him before he went on stage?" Richard did not answer immediately, his jaw tightening as he glanced around, aware suddenly of how many eyes had begun turning toward him rather than the stage. The silver-haired man who had also witnessed the earlier confrontation stepped closer, his booming voice now considerably quieter, though no less pointed. "That boy just outplayed every professional performer I have heard at any gala this year, and you tried to convince him not to go on stage at all." Richard's face reddened slightly, though whether from embarrassment or something closer to shame remained unclear. He opened his mouth as though to offer some defense, some explanation, but found that no words came easily. Daniel, still standing on stage beside Eli, continued addressing the crowd, unaware of the quiet confrontation unfolding near the front tables. "Tonight, we are reminded of something important," he said, his voice filled with genuine emotion. "Talent does not care about circumstance. It does not require wealth or privilege to exist. Sometimes, the most extraordinary gifts are found in the most unexpected places, waiting quietly for someone to simply give them a chance." The crowd applauded once more, warmer and more sustained this time, many guests rising again to their feet. Eli stood beside Daniel, overwhelmed by the outpouring of emotion now surrounding him, his earlier fear and hurt from Richard Kane's words slowly beginning to fade beneath the weight of everything happening around him. He glanced toward his mother again, watching as several guests approached her, offering handshakes and warm words, congratulating her on raising such an extraordinary son. Near the front, Richard Kane finally found himself approached directly by one of the gala's largest donors, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, who had witnessed the entire exchange from her seat throughout the evening. "Richard," she said firmly, loud enough for several nearby guests to hear clearly, "in all the years I have attended these events, I have never been more disappointed in someone's conduct than I was tonight, watching you speak to that child the way you did." Richard straightened his posture defensively. "I was simply being honest about my expectations," he said, though his voice carried far less confidence than it had earlier in the evening. The elderly woman shook her head slowly. "Honest, perhaps, but cruel as well. That boy proved every single assumption you made about him wrong, and he did it while carrying the weight of your words on his shoulders the entire time. I would say that speaks more to his character than it does to yours." Several nearby guests nodded in quiet agreement, and Richard found himself, for perhaps the first time in years, without any confident response prepared. He glanced toward the stage, toward Eli standing quietly beside Daniel, and something in his expression shifted once again, the earlier defensiveness slowly giving way to something closer to genuine reflection. He thought back briefly to his own childhood, decades earlier, memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit. He remembered standing outside a music shop window as a boy, staring at instruments his family could never afford, dreaming of possibilities that always seemed reserved for other people, wealthier people, people who had been given chances he never received. He had built his entire identity around leaving that childhood behind, around proving through wealth and success that he would never again be seen as someone unworthy of respect. Yet somewhere along the way, he realized now, standing amid the lingering applause still echoing through the ballroom, he had become the very kind of person who had once made him feel small and unworthy all those years ago. The realization settled over him slowly, heavily, mixing discomfort with something that felt uncomfortably close to shame. On stage, Daniel wrapped up his remarks, gesturing warmly toward Eli one final time. Please join me in thanking Eli Turner for one of the most memorable performances this gala has ever seen. The applause rose once more, filling the enormous room with sound, guests calling out words of praise and admiration as Eli offered a small, slightly shy bow, his earlier nerves finally beginning to ease beneath the warmth of such overwhelming support. As the applause continued, Richard Kane remained standing quietly among the crowd, watching the small boy on stage with an expression that had transformed completely since the beginning of the evening. Whatever cruel certainty he had carried earlier, whatever dismissive assumptions he had made backstage, all of it had been replaced now by something far more humbling, a quiet recognition that he had been wrong, not simply about Eli's talent, but about something far more important regarding the kind of man he had allowed himself to become. He glanced toward Grace, still surrounded by well-wishers near the back of the room, and toward Eli, still accepting applause from an audience that had completely reversed its earlier indifference. Something inside Richard Kane shifted in that moment, quiet but undeniable, the first small crack appearing in years of carefully constructed arrogance. Whether he would act on that realization remained to be seen, but for the first time in a very long while, Richard Kane found himself uncertain about something he had once considered absolutely, unquestionably certain. The rest of the gala passed in a blur for Eli. Guests he had never met approached him throughout the evening, offering kind words, business cards, and in some cases, tearful thanks for reminding them why they had chosen to support charitable causes in the first place. A well-known music teacher from the city's finest conservatory introduced herself, expressing genuine interest in meeting with Grace to discuss formal training opportunities for her son. A local newspaper reporter, covering the gala for the following morning's edition, asked if she could interview Eli briefly about his composition and his years of self-taught practice. Through it all, Eli remained polite but quiet, still slightly overwhelmed by everything happening around him. He kept glancing toward his mother whenever possible, finding comfort in her steady presence nearby, her proud smile never fading even as exhaustion began settling into her tired eyes. Richard Kane did not approach them that night. He remained near his table for the remainder of the evening, speaking little, his earlier confidence noticeably absent. Several times, Eli noticed him glancing toward the stage, toward Grace, though he made no move to cross the room. Whatever thoughts occupied his mind that night, he apparently was not yet ready to voice them. It was nearly a week later when Daniel called Grace with unexpected news. Richard Kane had personally requested a meeting, insisting it take place at his office downtown rather than anywhere connected to the gala itself. Grace hesitated at first, uncertain what such a meeting could possibly accomplish, especially after everything Richard had said to her son that evening. But Daniel encouraged her gently, reminding her that people sometimes needed time and distance before finding the courage to make things right. Grace and Eli arrived at Richard Kane's office on a quiet afternoon, the towering glass building rising far above the surrounding streets, nothing at all like the small apartment building where they lived. Eli felt nervous walking through the polished lobby, memories of that night at the gala still fresh in his mind, Richard's dismissive words echoing faintly beneath the surface of his thoughts. They were led into a spacious office on one of the highest floors, where Richard Kane stood near a large window overlooking the city below. He turned as they entered, and for a brief moment, silence filled the room, heavy and uncertain. Then Richard stepped forward, his earlier arrogance completely absent from his posture and expression. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly, gesturing toward two comfortable chairs positioned near his desk. Grace and Eli sat down carefully, still uncertain what to expect. Richard remained standing for a moment longer, seemingly gathering his thoughts before finally speaking again. "I owe you both an apology," he began, his voice steady but noticeably humbled compared to the confident tone Eli remembered from the gala. "What I said to you before your performance was wrong. Not simply unkind, but wrong in every sense. I made assumptions about your worth based on nothing more than your circumstances, and I allowed those assumptions to justify cruelty I have no excuse for." Eli sat quietly, unsure how to respond, watching Richard carefully as he continued speaking. "I have spent many years building a certain image of myself," Richard continued, his gaze drifting briefly toward the window, toward the city stretching out below. "Success, wealth, status. I convinced myself these things defined worth, defined talent, defined who deserved respect and who did not. Your performance reminded me how wrong that belief truly was." He paused, his expression growing more reflective. "It also reminded me of someone I used to be, a long time ago, before I built walls around that part of myself." Grace listened carefully, her expression calm but attentive, offering no immediate response, allowing Richard the space to continue. "I was not always wealthy. Richard admitted quietly, something Eli had never expected to hear from him. I grew up with very little, much like you and your son. I remember standing outside music shops as a child, wishing I could afford even the simplest instrument. Somewhere along the way, achieving success became more important to me than remembering where I came from, and I allowed that success to convince me that people without wealth simply lacked ability or worth. Your son proved that belief completely false, in front of an entire room of people who witnessed it firsthand. Eli finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady. Why did you say those things to me, if you understood what it felt like to be judged that way? Richard considered the question carefully before answering. Perhaps because remembering that part of my life is uncomfortable, he admitted honestly. It is easier to look down on others than to acknowledge how similar our beginnings might have been. That does not excuse what I said. It simply explains, poorly, why I said it. Grace finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. Apologies matter, Mr. Kane, but actions matter more. Richard nodded slowly, clearly having anticipated this response. Which is why I would like to offer something more than words. He walked toward his desk, retrieving a folder that he handed carefully toward Grace. I would like to fund Eli's music education completely. Private instructors, top-tier instruments, whatever he needs to develop his talent properly. Additionally, I intend to establish a scholarship fund through my foundation, specifically for talented young musicians from underserved communities, ensuring that circumstances never again prevent someone with genuine ability from having the opportunity to be heard. Grace opened the folder slowly, scanning the documents inside, her expression shifting from cautious surprise to quiet consideration. This is generous, she said carefully, but I want to make sure Eli's education remains balanced. Music is important, but so is everything else in his life. Richard nodded immediately. Of course. Whatever structure you feel is appropriate, I will support completely. This is not about controlling his path. It is about removing barriers that should never have existed for him in the first place. Eli glanced toward his mother, silently asking for guidance. Grace studied Richard's expression carefully for a long moment before finally nodding slowly. We would be grateful for that opportunity, she said finally, though I want you to understand something as well, Mr. Kane. Eli did not need your approval that night to prove his talent. He proved it through years of practice, determination, and love for music that existed long before your foundation ever sent that invitation. Richard nodded, accepting her words without argument. I understand that completely. If anything, that night taught me that true talent needs no permission to exist. It simply needs an opportunity to be seen. Over the following months, Eli's life began changing in ways he could hardly have imagined. He began formal lessons with a respected instructor recommended by the conservatory teacher he had met at the gala. His new piano, a proper acoustic instrument donated through Richard's foundation, replaced the old broken keyboard that had accompanied him through so many difficult years of practice. Grace, meanwhile, found herself invited to help design the structure of Richard's new scholarship program, drawing on her years of experience teaching underprivileged children in the community center. Word of Eli's performance spread throughout the city, thanks partly to the newspaper article published the following week, which detailed both his extraordinary talent and the inspiring story behind his self-taught journey. Messages of support poured in from strangers moved by his story, some sharing similar experiences of overcoming difficult circumstances through determination and passion. 6 months later, the Kane Foundation hosted another charity gala, this time with an added purpose, officially launching the newly established scholarship program for young musicians from underserved communities. Eli was invited once again, though this time not as an outreach performer added quietly to the evening's program, but as the guest of honor, specifically requested to open the evening celebrations. Standing backstage once more, Eli felt considerably less nervous than he had 6 months earlier. His new suit fit him properly this time, tailored specifically for the occasion rather than borrowed or purchased secondhand. His sheet music, though still carrying sentimental value from that first difficult night, now sat alongside several new compositions he had written during months of formal instruction. Daniel approached him backstage, smiling warmly, memories of their earlier conversation clearly present in his expression. "Ready for round 2?" he asked. Eli smiled confidently. "Ready." As he stepped onto the stage moments later, applause greeted him immediately, warm and welcoming rather than uncertain or distracted. Near the front of the ballroom, Richard Kane sat in the very first row, his earlier arrogance replaced permanently by quiet humility and genuine admiration. Beside him sat Grace, invited as an honored guest rather than someone forced to stand quietly at the back of the room. Eli sat at the piano, adjusted himself carefully, and glanced briefly toward his mother, who offered him the same steady, proud smile she always had. even during their most difficult years together. He began to play, the familiar melody flowing effortlessly beneath his fingers, though this time, surrounded by support rather than doubt. The music carried a different kind of energy entirely. Where the original performance had been born from struggle and quiet defiance, this performance flowed from gratitude, from hope fulfilled, from proof that circumstances, however difficult, never truly determined a person's worth or potential. As the final notes faded into another round of enthusiastic applause, Eli glanced toward Richard Kane, who rose to his feet along with the rest of the crowd, clapping with genuine warmth rather than empty politeness. Their eyes met briefly across the room, and Richard offered a small, respectful nod, an acknowledgement of everything that had changed since that first difficult evening months earlier. Eli returned the nod, feeling no trace of anger or resentment remaining from that night, only quiet satisfaction in knowing that his music, exactly as his mother had always promised, had answered every doubt far more powerfully than any argument ever could have. Later that evening, as the gala continued around them, Grace found a quiet moment to sit beside her son near the edge of the room, watching the celebration unfold before them. "I am proud of you," she said softly, "not simply for tonight, but for who you have always been." Eli leaned against her shoulder, exhausted but happy. "We did this together," he said quietly. Grace smiled, wrapping an arm around him gently. "Yes," she agreed, "we did." Outside the tall windows of the ballroom, the city lights stretched endlessly into the night, indifferent to the small, quiet victory that had unfolded within those walls. Yet for Eli and Grace, that victory meant everything, a reminder that talent, patience, and love, given enough time and enough courage, could overcome even the harshest judgment the world had to offer. And somewhere in that crowded ballroom, Richard Kane watched them both quietly, grateful, in his own way, for the lesson a 10-year-old boy and his broken keyboard had taught him about the true meaning of worth.